Henrik was like everyone else in New York. He was busy and he needed to work. He had actually recently moved to New York from Poland to visit his sister Lucina after he was laid off of work as a railway inspector. He worked really hard almost day and night just to make enough money so he could send some money back home to his wife and raise their two children. So his wife was still living in Poland and he had moved to New York. I'm not entirely sure if he moved to New York to visit his sister and then was like, "Oh, I kind of want to stay here and make some money," or if he went there for money. I'm not too sure exactly, but he did have intentions of coming back to Poland and building a new home. So I don't even know how long he was truly planning on being in New York for. So Henrik struggled very heavy with his English, and his sister had actually warned him that put him in a bigger risk in New York since a lot of people weren't very compassionate or patient with those who don't speak English. So it would also be harder for him to find a job. So he would actually take a lot of classes and he even watched TV with his sister to kind of grasp English better. So, what I could kind of gather from my own opinion about Henrik was he kind of viewed New York like a lot of us outsiders do, where it's like New York is this beautiful city of your dreams and you're walking your dog down the street and you're falling in love and you're just like, "Oh, New York is so beautiful. I love it." But the reality is New York is just a city and it's a massive city obviously, which means there's going to be a lot more crimes and it's going to be more dangerous and it's not all your little rom-coms that we love to watch in the early 2000s. And obviously, New York and any city, it's not just like a New York problem. If you don't really speak English or you are an immigrant, a lot of people are just not kind. They're not patient. And I mean, I can't obviously speak for New Yorkers because I mean, I'm not a New Yorker. And I kind of find there is that vibe from some New Yorkers that they don't really like tourists, which I mean, I don't blame them because, when tourists do come to the city and they're kind of doing things where you're like, what are you doing? I remember when I went to Banff, this is a side note, and there were people trying to take photos with the goats, the mountain goats, and I was like, oh no, get away from those. They're going to hurt
Oh
you.
my god, yeah. Or when you see like they're on the side of the road and like people are jumping out of their cars to go get a picture, like a selfie with these bears, I'm like, buddy.
Yeah, I'm like, "What are you doing?" Of course, I understand, like, for some New Yorkers, they're very busy. They don't want a bunch of tourists standing in the middle of the road or just, like, the sidewalk. So, of course, there can be that. It kinda has that vibe, right? Like, in any kind of city, and it seems like Henrik had that vibe that he really loved New York, and he didn't wanna believe it was as dangerous. Even though his sister and even his landlady were kind of like, "Hey, New York isn't it's not all amazing." He would kind of brush it off, which, I mean, don't we all kind of do that? You're going to go to a city, you're going to you want to romanticize it. You want to be like, no, I'm like living my best life. Even though Henrik's English wasn't as great, he was able to secure a job in Manhattan where he did construction work. He would work at multiple different sites. One morning, for Henrik and many other Americans, their lives would completely change. At approximately 8:46 a.m., a plane would fly into the North Twin Tower. Most people were shocked and confused. They thought it was a mistake. Maybe the pilot just wasn't paying attention to how low they were because these towers were massive. They were around 1,368 feet or around 417 meters high. So, I mean, that's pretty tall. When it was 9:03 a.m., another plane would crash into the other tower. People were terrified, obviously. They knew that this wasn't a mistake, and obviously the president was like, "Hey guys, this is a terrorist attack." And I mean, obviously, I'm not going to go into the theories of whether it was an inside job or not, but a lot of people were terrified of what happened, and they didn't know if there was going to be more attacks, what's going to go on, and most planes don't actually crash, and when they do, it's fairly rare. And again, to have two planes crash in the same location only a few minutes apart, that's not a coincidence. And then having a plane also crash into the Pentagon, like that wasn't just a coincidence. And of course, the other plane that would crash into a field. So nearly 3,000 people were killed, and it's estimated that 25,000 people were injured. Almost everyone in New York was scared. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so obviously a lot of businesses were closed down because some of them literally didn't have a business anymore. Some people didn't have homes and it was just closed down to be secured, making sure nothing else is going to happen. And this included Henrique's job. Apparently Henrique had actually seen one of the planes fly into the tower, which that would be so terrifying. When he was sent back home, he ended up calling his wife to let her know, like, hey, I'm okay, I'm safe. And she had told him, don't leave yet, like, don't come back. I don't think flying's pretty safe. So I don't know if Henrik was planning on leaving in the next few weeks or if he was still planning on staying there. But because he didn't have a job, he knew that he needed to go and look for a job still. So he ended up looking at some job ads in the Polish language newspaper, and there was actually a job posting for a cleaning service at a Pathmark supermarket in Brooklyn. It was an overnight job and he thought it was perfect. I mean, it's going to pay his bills, it's not going to be that hard. And so he ended up going down to the employment agency right away. This guy wasn't even going to take a day off, and he went to the employment agency to fill in some papers. Actually, when he was there, the owner, she was very distraught, but she was also upset because her husband worked in the Twin Towers and she hadn't heard from him since that morning. And we do find out later that her husband did unfortunately pass from the attack. But Henrique did try comforting her and trying to be there for her. I just think that's so sad, but there wasn't really a whole lot of information on exactly what he said to her or what happened with that woman or her husband, but still, it's really nice to see that he was trying to comfort her. So he learned that he could start that night, and him and his landlady got a map together and they were looking up a little route that he could take. And he was going to need to travel to Albany Avenue. So his landlady was very nervous, like everyone else, because of the attack. And also, Henry didn't speak English that well. And this location he was going to wasn't the safest. And they weren't very welcoming to people that weren't from that neighborhood. So she tried to kind of be like, hey, why don't you just like stay back? Why don't you take a day to yourself? You don't really need to go out. Just take a day to yourself. And it's also really dangerous. And he was kind of like, no, I'm going to do this. It's going to be fine. And she couldn't really convince him. And so he was going to start that day. So he didn't know the man that he was going to be meeting for the job, but he told the agency what he was going to be wearing, which will be relevant a little bit later. So, roughly around 11 p.m., he got off the train and began to walk west of Fulton Street towards Albany Avenue, which was only a few blocks away. One of the things that's really sad about this, too, is he actually had the wrong place that he was heading to. They later found that out, that he was heading in the wrong direction. So, like I said, this neighborhood was not safe. According to one of the lead detectives, they're a very tight knit community and they don't really like people who don't live in that area. They just, this is their zone. So, roughly around 11:40 p.m., residents could hear an argument and gunshots. One of them actually had heard their doorbell ring, but they didn't want to go out to check on it, assuming they were probably too scared. And I mean, this is a location that's not the safest, so maybe they were like, I don't want to open the door. But a few minutes later, they could see a man face down in the street, and there was a trail of blood because he had staggered his way and had just fallen. Henrik was shot in his lung, and what had happened was after he was shot, he walked a little bit near the north end of Albany and he went to this townhouse to try and get help, but they wouldn't answer the door and he had just fallen face first. By the time the police even arrived, I think they only arrived a few minutes later, he was already gone. He was just 46 years old. Because again of this terrorist attack, a lot of the officers were on duty and some were working overtime, some had been called from their vacation, and a lot of them were patrolling ground zero or areas nearby trying to help rescue people. So almost the entire police force was occupied, which a lot of these criminals use this to their advantage. So the New York Police Department couldn't really use all of their resources that they typically would have used in a normal homicide. Normally, a crime scene unit would be called to secure the lot and collect evidence, but none of the members of that unit were available. There also wasn't that many cameras like there is now. They had to rely very heavy on witnesses and what they had to say. And, no one had cameras. They didn't have a lot of phones, all that. So it was really impossible for them to find a perpetrator. From what they could find was Henrik was shot at 7 times, but he was only hit once right in his lung. They were able to rule out robbery because he had $75 in his wallet, so they don't really understand why he died, and they theorize that Henrik himself probably didn't know because his English was so poor. And maybe they had yelled at him to leave and he couldn't understand, but they don't really know if that's even the truth. His family and a lot of people believe that maybe they thought he was a terrorist. So Henrik is Polish, but he does have a bit of a darker complexion and darker hair. Some people think maybe they thought he was a terrorist because of that, and also he was wearing camel pants and a jacket and boots, which maybe they thought he was part of the military. And the fact that he struggled with English, maybe they thought he was a terrorist. It doesn't really matter if he was Arab or not, because obviously, if he was, that doesn't mean he should be shot and killed. But that is one of the leading theories that a lot of the investigators and even his family think that might have happened. It's very important to note that during this time, a lot of Americans, especially white Americans, began to hate Arab people, accusing them of being terrorists, and a lot of them were very unfortunately murdered during this time. Even some Arab families whose loved ones actually died in 9/11 were ostracized out of these help groups because people looked at Arab people like they were the enemy when it was just the extremist group, which is Al Qaeda. Even people that weren't even Arab would be accused of being terrorists, but if they kind of, looked Arab, people would just become very racist. Obviously, this hate did not start with 9/11. It's been on for centuries, but 9/11 for sure heightened this because the terrorists were obviously from the Middle East. It's important that we remember Henrik when we remember 9/11, and for his family. They still haven't received any justice. They haven't received any peace of mind of what happened to their brother, their husband, their father, and their friend. They still have no idea what happened to Henrik, and we probably never will unless someone does know some kind of information. I don't see a lot of people talk about him, and I just think it's very important that we remember people like Henrik that were murdered during this time, and also people that were murdered that are Arab, all because of 9/11 and all of that. It's just awful. But if you do have any information, I will leave the links in the description below that give you some more information, to leave some tips to Crime Stoppers, or you can call the police. And they are giving people a reward of $10,000 if you do have any information. So I will leave that in the description. So, Diana Robertson was in a relationship with Mike Reimer. They had a 2-year-old little girl named Crystal. They had a very complicated relationship. It wasn't very healthy. Diana was just old enough to hit the club and go out drinking with her friends. She was 21, and Mike was 36, and he actually had been dating Diana since she was 17 when he was like 32. I usually wouldn't mention this in this episode or in our cases, but their relationship was very abusive and wasn't good, and I feel like with the age gap that was already a red flag. Mike was your typical abusive boyfriend where he would get mad at Diana for everything. He'd blow up on her. He was physically abusive, emotionally. He was your typical abusive prick where he was cheating on her and then he's accusing her of cheating. And he had even slashed her tires. The worst of it all, though, was just 2 months prior to this case, on October 19th, 1985, Mike was actually arrested for DV. because he actually broke into Diana's apartment and started to be very physically violent with her. He pushed her face into the carpet. It was awful, and Diana was actually able to get away from him and call the police. And with this, she kind of just had enough of the abuse, and she finally was supposed to get a restraining order that was supposed to go in effect in January of 1986. But around Christmas time, Diana and Mike seemed to try and make it work. I'm sure he probably did what most abusers do and probably gaslighted her, probably love bombed her, probably sweet talked her. And with them having a 2-year-old little girl and also it's Christmas, maybe Diana was like, let's try and make this work. Darlene, who was Diana's sister, she didn't really know why Diana would go back to Mike, but she kind of speculated that maybe Mike gave Diana some security. It's also extremely hard when you have a child just to leave because there could have been multiple reasons as to why. He also could have just been your typical abusive boyfriend where he was love bombing her in this stage. It's so common for victims to stay in abusive relationships. According to National Domestic Violence Hotline, victims typically try to leave their abusers 7 times. And a lot of times when victims do end up trying to leave, they do end up being murdered by their own abuser. So it's not just like this simple just leave. Now, it was noted that even though Mike was abusive to Diana, he wasn't abusive to Crystal. Although I would argue that even if a child isn't being abused, if they're witnessing that abuse, it's still as harmful and can affect them in the long run and how they view relationships. And it's another form of abuse. It's just like secondhand. But it seemed that they were going to try and make things work out. So they decided to spend some family time by traveling down to Nisqually River and look for a tree to cut down for Christmas. While Mike was going to go and check on some fur traps that he had created. So during the warm months and majority of the year, he was a roofer, but during the colder months and in the winter, he would do some fur traps that he would check on daily. So it seemed that they wanted to do two things at once. They were going to go and cut down a tree, and Mike was going to check on some of these traps, and then they were going to head home that night. But unfortunately, neither of them were going to be able to come home that night. It wasn't really until later when Louise was very confused on how she hadn't heard from her daughter. She always heard from her, and so it was just rubbing her the wrong way. And same thing with Lloyd, who was Mike's dad. He was already kind of confused. He hadn't heard from Mike. Even their friends were like, why haven't we heard from them? So obviously, they kept in contact with their friends and family on a regular basis. Their friends would end up driving near the locations that Mike would do some fur traps, but they never found them. But during this time, that's when Crystal was actually found in the Kmart that was 30 miles away. After she was placed into custody, she was then on the local news, and that is when Louise would see Crystal, and this just probably made her heart drop. When she finally was able to go and meet up with Crystal, Crystal was so excited. It probably was the first time she had seen anybody she recognized in a few days. But this was making Louise really nervous because why was Diana and Mike not around? Even though they had a really abusive relationship, they typically were always on the same page when it came to Crystal. And so for Louise, she thought this was really odd that they were never around. And so when she tried to ask questions, Crystal was, she's 2 years old. It's really hard to get an answer out of a toddler. But on top of that, she just seemed really scared. And, if she's traumatized, she's probably not going to talk about it because she's traumatized. But that's when she would go on to say, Mommy's in the trees. This is generally such a haunting thing because this could mean anything. This could mean that she's just in the woods, or is she literally in a tree? Like, what happened? Did she witness her mom do something? But the question that made everyone so confused is how did Crystal end up 30 miles away from where her parents supposedly were? She's just 2 years old. It's not like she could have just like hopped in a car and drove herself there. It's not like she would have been able to walk there in the middle of the night. It just didn't make any sense. And so someone had to have dropped her off there. But nobody really knew, and there was no leads for a really long time. It wasn't until February, just a few months later, just 3 miles of Alder Lake, there was this dog. He was out with its owners, and the dog started to run. It was kind of like this abandoned area. And that's when this dog would end up running over to this truck that seemed abandoned. The owners obviously were like, that's kind of weird. What's going on? And that's when they would see a body of a young woman dead just behind the truck. Obviously, they called the police. What they saw was just so disturbing. This girl had tube socks tied around her neck, and she had been stabbed over 17 times. And it was confirmed to be Diana, but Mike wasn't around. And so, like most cases, whenever a woman is dead and her boyfriend or her husband or her partner isn't around, most people are going to assume it's her partner. That's just statistically the way it works. And so, with Mike being gone, they pretty much were like, it had to have been Mike. He also was extremely abusive to her. And on top of this, Mike's dad said that Mike knew how to live in the forest for a long time, like on his own. So obviously, everybody was like really suspicious of this. And then they also found a note that said, I love you, Diana. So obviously, everyone was like, maybe this is Mike. Maybe he killed her and went on a run. Where is he? But Mike's dad felt like this wasn't true. He really believed his son was innocent. For one, Mike had actually left his coat in the truck and he also abandoned his truck. This is also a time when it's extremely cold. If you live anywhere where it snows, you don't just leave your coat in your truck and then walk away. He would have had to walk about 2 to 3 miles just to get to the main road. So why would he leave his jacket? It just seemed like it wouldn't make sense. On top of this, he also didn't pick up his last paycheck and his bank account remained untouched. There had been no money taken out of it before or even after, so it wasn't like he just took a bunch of money and went on the run. It was almost like Mike just vanished into thin air, and nobody really knew where he was. Majority of the family and a lot of people during these years pretty much just believed Mike was off, living his new life and just got away with murder. But fast forward to 2011, there was a man who was out with his neighbor and they were walking on their property, looking at some property markers when they would find a skull under some bushes. This skull was completely clean, but it had no upper jaw, and there was a giant hole in the side of the head. Now, they were able to confirm that this wound was not from a gun, but they don't really know what caused it, and there was no weapons to be found. This skull, though, was found 100 miles away from where Diana was found, and after being analyzed, they were able to confirm this was Mike. It is unknown of what happened to Mike or who got to Mike because his body wasn't there, it was just his skull. As of what we know, no one has actually ever been found for who killed Diana and Mike, but it's speculated that they weren't the only victims. So on August 10th, 1985, just a few months prior to this case, Stephen Harkin and his girlfriend Ruth Cooper were last seen attending a wedding with their friends, and then after they were planning on doing a weekend getaway, when only a few days later, Stephen was actually found dead in his sleeping bag along with his dog, and his girlfriend Ruth was actually found a few months later when a few hunters had found her body, and then they found her skull only 50 feet away from her where her body was. And they were both found in the same area where Diana and even Mike were found. Some of the similarities with this case was that first, both Diana and Ruth were found to have a tube sock wrapped around their neck with the exact same knot. And couples were both found miles apart from each other, the skull and the body not being in the same place. And also the couples had like a massive age gap, although it was like flip-flopped. Ruth was 44 and Stephen was 27. Although this could just be a coincidence, this might not really be anything else. But that was kind of one of those things where people felt like it was just too similar. So, a lot of the theories are that there is a serial killer that was out killing young couples without ever getting caught and is technically still out there to this very day, or that Mike himself was the killer and that he killed this couple first and then he killed Diana. There was a point where Diana had actually told her mom that Mike threatened to kill her, and he even bragged about how he could get away with it. But Louise felt like he was just kind of talking his talk. He was just trying to make her scared. And a lot of people would go on to say that they believed that Mike was abusive, but they didn't think that he would ever kill. Although I do want to say that most times when someone is an abuser, even if it starts off verbal, it'll go to physical. And usually, when it gets to be physical, it's only a matter of time when they might kill you, whether it's intentional or not. And I just have to say, if you are in a relationship with someone and they're talking about how they could kill you and get away with it, you need to leave now. Obviously, I do not want to be victim blaming the family or even Diana because, I mean, maybe they really thought like he was just joking. And again, we have really no idea if Mike actually killed Diana. Mike can be two things at once, he can still be an abusive partner and he can also be a victim of a murder. But I mean, we really don't know if he killed Diana and then did he kill himself. Some theories are that Diana was seeing someone new and then Mike found out and he lashed out on her when they were out getting this tree or that he lured her there. But I mean, we will never know. I mean, there's not a whole lot of like evidence to back that one up, but it's like incredibly hard to know. The family still believe that it was Mike. However, Mike's family and friends really have said they believe he was innocent and that this killer got to him first, maybe, and then Diana. The only suspect in this case, besides Mike, was a man named Billy Ray Billard, who was arrested and charged with murder in 1989. So there was this couple, Edward Smith and Kimberly Levine, who disappeared during a weekend getaway in Grant County, Washington, and they were actually found murdered in separate locations. But really, the only connection they really had is that they were a young couple, they were found in the same area, and that their bodies were in different areas, but that's really it. Billy never confirmed that he killed Diana and Mike. So, I mean, who knows? But there's still a lot of questions to be asked. For one, apparently the day the couple went missing, early in the morning, Mike actually showed up to his dad's house with Crystal and not Diana. And when Lloyd was offering them breakfast, he said that they couldn't stay, that they didn't have any time. And then apparently he had actually brought Crystal to the Kmart, and a Salvation Army ringer had apparently seen him between 4 and 5 p.m. And when they came back from their break, his truck was gone. But it's hard to know if that's even true or if that's just a made up story. But it is very interesting to think that Mike showed up by himself with Crystal without Diana. That just didn't seem like Diana would have done that. So some of the theories are that maybe Mike had killed Diana at this point and then brought Crystal to go see her grandpa, and then maybe he dropped her off at the Kmart and potentially had a lot of guilt for what he did and maybe he took his life. It's really confusing to know really what happened to Mike. It seems pretty obvious that Mike did it because, I mean, he did have that court case that was supposed to go in effect a month before they went missing, but I mean, we will really never know. Years later, Crystal still holds on to memories of her lost parents. Louise said that she kept a picture of Diana on her dresser, and Crystal would always show her new items to her mom, and I think that's so sweet and also so sad. On April 29th, 1991, in Vanderhoof, British Columbia, Dawn and Eldon Scott would bring into the world Madison. She would go on to go by the name Maddie, and she grew up with two siblings, Ben and Georgia, and their family was very close knit. They were just a very tight, close family that just kind of lived their life. Maddie was interesting because she wasn't really your stereotypical girly girl, but she also wasn't your stereotypical tomboy. She kind of was a mixture of both. She was kind of like the girl that loved to wear dresses, but she also loved to wear overalls and get kind of into the dirt. She definitely was more of an outdoorsy girl. She loved dirt biking, she loved hockey, horseback riding, sports of all kinds, and also hanging out with her friends. Maddie was described as this fun girl who just loved to make her friends laugh. And she did kind of what a lot of teens did in 2011 and even prior. She made a lot of YouTube videos, which is something that Kira and I used to do. Well, I mean, we still technically do this. Madison was just definitely your fun girl. She just loved making her friends laugh. And she was quite free spirited, which kind of showed up on her wrist because she actually had a bird tattoo on her wrist. Now, I don't know exactly the meaning behind this tattoo, but it kind of just shows you like she just had this free spirit. She was a risk taker, but she also was very responsible. She would make sure her grades were all good, that she did everything she needed, but she also would go and spend time with her friends. So she kind of did her own thing. She kind of had like the perfect mix between going to school and making sure her grades are good, but also having fun with her friends and partying. But she always made sure that her responsibilities were done. After she graduated high school in 2009, she would work as an apprentice heavy duty mechanic with her father at MBG Logging. So, when Madison was 20, on May 27th, 2011, Maddie and her friend Jordy were planning on going on this little camping trip to Hogsback Lake, which was roughly around 23 kilometers away from Vanderhoof. It's only about like a 25 to 30-minute drive. This place, like I said earlier, is just very beautiful. It's just very relaxing. And they were kind of just planning to go there with a few of their friends. So Maddie would drive there in her truck, and once her and Maddie kind of got to the campsite, they were gathering some firewood, but after some time, Maddie realized that she needed a bigger tent and some more poles. So she decided to get back into her truck and go back home. After she returned, it seemed like this was supposed to be just a stereotypical, like, friend thing, but there was a post that went around Facebook kind of being like, hey guys, we're going to be having a party. If you've ever grown up in a smaller town, especially when Facebook was like very bopping, it was so common just for people to be like, hey, we're throwing a party. I know people still kind of do this like on Snapchat or even like Instagram close friends, but on Facebook, like I always remember seeing people being like, we're throwing a party. And of course, this is in British Columbia, so the legal drinking age I think is 19. So obviously, a lot of these kids, they were coming in and they were showing up with alcohol, and it kind of went from it being a couple friends to a lot of people kind of just relaxing and drinking, and it got pretty rowdy. So once Maddie kind of arrived there, it seemed that she might have been tired or whatever, so she ended up retiring back to her tent. I'm not exactly sure if she got there later or if she was just tired or maybe there was just too many people or what, but she ended up going back into her tent. Unfortunately, with more people and more drunk people means you're going to get people that are a little too rowdy. So there was a fight that broke out around midnight, and this fight happened between Jordy and she ended up hurting her wrist. I'm not exactly sure what the fight was about, but it was enough for Jordy to be like, I'm gonna go and leave with my boyfriend. But before she left, she ended up going to where Maddie was and asked if she wanted to go home with her, but Maddie decided to stay back. In the following morning, on Saturday at like 8:30 in the morning, Jordy and her boyfriend would come back to kind of collect some of Jordy's things, like her sleeping bag and her clothes. And when she went into Maddie's tent, Maddie wasn't there. Her clothes and her sleeping bag and her truck and everything was still there. So Maddie was probably just maybe hiking or maybe she was hanging out with some other people. It is like a nice camping spot where, you can go on these little hikes. And so Jordy just ended up leaving with her boyfriend again. And the last time Maddie was ever seen was that night. So there was actually a second party. Now, I don't know if this party was bigger, if it was more crazy, or what really happened, but this was the last time Maddie was ever seen. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, Maddie's parents realized they hadn't heard from Maddie. She hadn't been texting them, And clearly, this must have been enough for them to be really worried. So they ended up getting in their truck and driving down to the campsite around noon. Once they arrived, they found Maddie's tent that had been flattened, like it was getting ready to be packed back up. Her truck was there, but Maddie was nowhere to be seen. Maddie's truck was also locked, meaning she had her keys, but they couldn't find Maddie. After some time of them not being able to get a hold of Maddie, not being able to find her, they would end up calling the RCMP. And once the police arrived, they kind of were interviewing a few people and they would end up making a missing persons report. The only item of Maddie's that was missing was her iPhone and also her keys. Now, Hogsback Lake is roughly around 128 acres with clear water. And the clear water you can actually see within 10 feet. So they had to look everywhere. These search parties included divers searching the lake. They had people on boats. They even had people search by foot, by quads, horseback, vehicles, helicopters. And they also had canines and cadaver dogs, anything that could kind of help them search for Maddie. They even had friends and family coming in and searching everywhere. They actually were searching well into the night. I believe it was like until like 10 p.m. But they could only search so far because the forest is dense. They actually were all like holding hands as they were walking into the forest because they wanted to make sure they weren't going to get lost. And obviously, with a forest, once it's too dense, you really can't go any further because you're going to end up as a missing person too. So they really weren't able to get any leads on Maddie. Obviously, they were doing interviews on everyone. It seemed like there was nothing that went wrong. It was almost as if Madison just vanished into thin air. Maddie didn't really have any enemies. She didn't have, some crazy ex that was threatening her. There wasn't any leads that kind of would be like, oh, well, maybe she got in a fight with this person. It just didn't make any sense. So, Maddie's friends and family, they would do a lot of events, fundraisers. They also created a website called findmaddie.ca, which is actually still active today. Although the last post was in 2024, this website has a lot of information on Maddie. It has a lot of pictures of her. It also has information if you have to contact them if you know anything. But they had this website. They also created billboards. They used social media. They had a reward for $100,000 if anyone had any information on who did this to her or if they knew what happened. But it seemed like there was nothing. Even 48 hours raised awareness, as well as Crime Stoppers. And obviously, like YouTube and podcasts like this were bringing more awareness, but nothing. Nothing was found until 2023, 12 years later, almost to the exact date. Maddie's remains were found on a rural property around 20 kilometers or 12 miles from Hogsback Lake. So, a few sources stated that this farmer was digging up on his land, and that's when he found these remains. So, she had been buried. Obviously, they were able to identify this as Madison. But this raised a lot more concerns. What happened to Madison? Why was she 20 kilometers away from where she was? Why didn't she take her truck? How was she so close but so far away at the same time? It just didn't make any sense. So, I'm kind of going to go over some theories. So, a few theories is foul play, of course. It could have been as simple as Madison got in a fight with somebody and maybe they hurt her, or maybe she was drunk, or did she reject somebody, or it could honestly be anything. It could be as simple as someone got drunk, maybe they did something, they hurt her, and then they panicked and they went and hid her body. Because the thing is, where Maddie was hidden, it wasn't really walking distance. It wouldn't have made any sense for her to be there. It seems more plausible that she either was transported there after she died or she traveled there before her death and then was killed, and then whoever did this maybe potentially buried her. I don't even know how she ended up on this rural property. That's what's so odd. Some people were trying to theorize with her getting drunk they were saying that it would have made more sense if she ended up in the water, which I agree with. I feel like her getting walking off and getting drunk, I feel like that theory would make more sense if she was found in the lake, but she wasn't. Another major theory is the Highway of Tears, which we actually did discuss this in one of our like earlier episodes. I think it was like episode 10. So, for those of you who don't know what the Highway of Tears is, it's this massive highway that is roughly 700 kilometers or 447 miles across British Columbia. It's on Highway 16, and this location is known to be quite dense with forest. And a lot of girls and women end up missing and they're never found again. Except typically, the victims that are usually going missing and being taken on this highway are Indigenous women. And Madison, from what I can tell, is white. And I'm not saying that that couldn't happen, but it wouldn't really make sense for her to be on that highway and for something to happen to her and then for her to be taken to a rural property. Because typically, what people do on that highway is they will rape or they will kill these young girls and then they just hide them in this dense forest because it's too hard to find people in that forest. Also, this highway is massive. So, this definitely could be a theory, but logically, to me, it doesn't really make much sense for her to be found on a rural property, if that makes sense. There were some theories from locals on Reddit, and I mean, take Reddit with a grain of salt, that there were these two shady brothers that killed her, but I couldn't really find any evidence or any sources on this. So I don't really want to blast two random guys because I mean, for all I know, these could just be two people on Reddit that have beef with these guys and it's nothing. And from what we know, everybody that was at the party and at the campsite was cleared. There was no evidence leading to them. And so there really is nothing that is leading anyone to Madison. From what we know now, this case is still ongoing. A few days after Maddie was found, on June 3rd, 2023, a vigil was held at her high school, and it was very beautiful. And it was a way for her family and her friends to at least be able to put her to rest because, of course, for 12 years, they didn't know where she was. They didn't know if she was alive or if she was taken somewhere. It's important that when we remember Maddie, we don't just see her as another missing girl or another statistic, and that we see her as the person she was. She was this fun, creative, outdoorsy girl that made her friends laugh. She had family and friends that loved her. I always hate ending episodes where it's like we don't really have a conclusion, but I just don't want to kind of just turn Madison into another concept, another missing girl that we make an episode on. I just think it's important that we remember that Madison was a real person and her friends and family are still there and they're still trying to find out who did this to her. And I do think it's almost kind of beautiful to know that Madison still impacts a lot of her friends and family to this very day. And I just hope that her family and friends are able to get some kind of closure. And I really hope that they're able to get some information on who killed Madison. As of right now, we have no idea.
The crimes primarily unfolded in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, specifically in Salisbury North during the 1990s. This whole region was characterized at the time as having urban decay, I'm going to describe it as, where there was a lot of unemployment. Things were dirty and a little bit unsafe due to a lack of social safety nets. There was a environment where vulnerable, isolated individuals were easily manipulated and they were able to disappear without anyone noticing. The bodies in the barrels is somewhat misleading, as only one of the murders actually occurred in Snowtown, and like the whole case is known as the Snowtown murders. However, it was merely the final resting place for 8 of the victims because of where these bodies were found, as they were found in an abandoned bank building, which was rented by one of the accomplices in today's case, Mark Hayden. And we will get into all the accomplices and all the victims today. But The perpetrators and their victims were part of a closed social circle, and this led to an internal predation, which is pretty rare as far as serial killers go, as most of them choose to go after complete strangers, but they all knew each other. In the Snowtown case, lovers, friends, relatives, and neighbors were transformed into targets or weapons. Like I said, the environment of this time in Adelaide provided a cloak of invisibility in a community where government reliance and this lifestyle was part of the norm, where some people would suddenly move away or to a different suburb. It was more the drifter lifestyle. Today's case heavily relied on how John Bunting was able to manipulate the people around him. This includes both the victims and the accomplices, as these were people with low levels of formal education. They had cognitive disabilities or histories of severe trauma. This demographic is frequently susceptible to manipulation, as we can see time and time again, especially if we're in a case of having a powerful, charismatic figure who offers a sense of purpose by just following a simple framework. They will be able to have success and have these great lives. It's easy to convince people who don't have a lot that they can do something about it. John didn't offer friendship, he offered a crusade. By identifying pedophiles as the source of the community's troubles, he provided a target for the residents' frustrations and a justification for the violence that would follow. One of the first victims, Clinton Trissé, was found in lower light. However, a lot of today's case, there were remote torture sites and temporary burial sites used in order to move victims away from surveillance during their torture. But I'll get into it in a little bit here. The group was led by John Bunting, who had served as the primary manipulator for the other participants. He had this innate ability to coerce others into committing extreme acts of depravity, as he was pretty organized and charismatic. John's personality was interesting to say the least. He was described as a warm, friendly father figure to some people, and for others, they described him as the master, as he dominated them. John was born on September 4th of 1966, and his early childhood was wrought with trauma. At age 8, he was beaten and sexually assaulted by an older brother of a friend. Later on, it's not far to stretch your imagination, as this would perhaps be a precursor to his later obsession about his hatred of pedophiles. So it could have been that he sought to destroy the very image of what his abuser had done to him. John also exhibited early indicators of the McDonald triad, which includes animal torture. During his childhood, he was known to torture ants with acid, and in late adulthood, he progressed to killing and skinning cats and dogs, often forcing his stepson James Valcaz, hopefully I pronounced that right, to watch or participate even. Eventually, he would move on to being able to do this to other victims. He interestingly lacked a sense of smell starting from birth, which enabled him later on to tolerate the horrific stench of what he had done in this bank vault. A smell so potent, it eventually alerted the public and the authorities despite the vault seal. As a young adult, John worked as an abattoir where he reportedly bragged about the slaughter of animals, identifying it as an aspect of the job he enjoyed the most. This comfort with gore and destruction of a corpse translated later on in his life. By the time he moved to Salisbury North in 1991, he had begun to cultivate sort of this vigilante persona as he created a rock spider wall. And that's where you get a chart of names connected by yarn, representing individuals he thought might be pedophiles or homosexuals. This wall wasn't merely a list of targets, it was a tool that he used to implicate his accomplices. By selecting names from the wall and discussing their infractions, John created a shared delusion of righteousness that what they were doing was right. He convinced his followers that the victims were the disease and that their group was the cure. So, his accomplices. John was able to identify individuals who were either as damaged as himself or so malleable that he could make them into his own image. One of his first accomplices was Robert Wagner. He befriended John in 1991 and became his most loyal accomplice. Previously, he was active in neo Nazi groups. Robert already possessed an extreme worldview that valued dominance and violence. And put two and two together, it was not good. Robert's relationship with John was one of absolute loyalty. He was the primary enforcer and active participant in almost every single murder. Despite the group's stated mission to target homosexuals, Robert himself was reportedly involved in a long term relationship with Barry Lane, who was a cross dresser and convicted pedophile who would later become one of the group's victims. So, this whole vigilante, oh, we only go after pedophiles, was a pretty thin veneer for the two of them, I would say. During trial, Robert appeared to relish in the details of his crimes, viewing himself as a necessary tool to get rid of all these people. One of the other accomplices in today's case was James Valakis, and again, I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right, who entered John's orbit as a teenager when his mother, Elizabeth Harvey, began a relationship with John. James was a unique figure in the case, to say the least. He was John's stepson, and for people that knew him, they described him as a passive protagonist, someone who was eventually groomed and coerced into the killing operation. John initially acted as a warm, charismatic father figure, something that James had been missing his entire life. However, the relationship soon turned dark as John used animal torture as initiation, forcing James to watch the skinning of animals in order to desensitize himself to the violence that John would later go on to force him to do. James eventually participated in the torture and murder of his own half brother, Troy Udy, and his stepbrother, David Johnson. His involvement was driven by a combination of fear and a warped sense of familial duty. James eventually cooperated with the Crown and was a pivotal factor in securing the convictions against John and Robert, providing firsthand testimony that forensic evidence alone could not. Mark Hayden was another one of the accomplices in today's case, as he assisted in the disposal of bodies, including that of his own wife, Elizabeth Hayden, and Troy Yodi. So all these people are intermingled with each other. That's James's half brother Troy. But Mark's role was largely logistical as he rented the Snowtown Bank building in January of 1999 specifically to store these barrels which contained the victims. While Mark claimed to be less involved in the actual killings, his participation in moving the remains of his own wife and son illustrates just how deep he was involved in this. So, Robert participated in 10 of the murders. James witnessed, participated in 4 of the murders. It's just crazy how manipulated these people were. Finally, Elizabeth as well. She was an accomplice in all this as she had knowledge of the crimes and assisted in at least one of the murders. So it was very weird how John would go about selecting them as he imagined infractions. The selection process itself were very fluid as He had a mantra that they would go after pedophiles and homosexuals, but this eventually moved on to, oh, did they use drugs? Oh, were they obese? Oh, were these people just weak or a risk to our security? As far as I know, those aren't pedophiles. The first victim, Clinton Trias, was 20 when he was murdered in August of 1992. John invited Clinton into his Salisbury home, where he eventually bludgeoned him to death with a shovel. The motive was he had a suspicion of pedophilia based on flimsy evidence. Clinton's body was buried in a shallow grave at Lower Light, where it remained undiscovered for 2 years. This murder was only the beginning of John's operation, as his next victim would come more quickly. His name was Ray Allen Peter Davies, who was only age 26 when he was murdered. He was a intellectually disabled man who lived in a caravan behind the home of John's ex-girlfriend, Suzanne Ellen. In December of 1995, he was targeted after allegations were made that he approached children. James testified that John and Robert drove Ray to a remote residence in Barcata and tortured him in a bathtub, where they bashed his genitals with a pole until he died. John's ex-girlfriend, Suzanne Ellen, who was aged 47, was an associate of John until her remains were found buried in his backyard in May of 1999, wrapped in 11 plastic bags. While John claimed she died of a heart attack, no way. This man murdered her straight. Like, why would you bury her in a backyard? But the prosecution suspects that it was murder, even though it was not founded, that there was a deterioration in their relationship and John just murdered her. Her death marks a critical transition as John began to realize that the disappearance of his own associates could be profitable. He continued to collect her pension, totaling to $17,000 for years after her death. As John's influence over Robert and James solidified, the frequency and brutality of the killings increased. The victims were no longer just suspected pedophiles, but were chosen for potential financial gain or to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. Their next victim, Michael Wagner, who was only 19 when they strangled him with a rope. To cover their crime, John and Robert staged a robbery at his home to convince his partner that he had fled to pay for gender affirming surgery. Barry Lane, who was 42, was a former lover of Robert Wagner. Like I mentioned, he was a cross-dresser, but he was tortured and killed in 1997. His body was just one of those found in the barrels. Thomas Trevelyan was 18 when he was found hanging from a tree, initially thought to be a suicide, but later it was revealed that he was murdered by the group. Gavin Poiter, who was 29, he was a roommate of James, who was strangled in a car when it was parked on John's driveway. Then finally, there was the betrayal of the family. Troy Yodi, who was 21, was James's half-brother. In September of 1998, he was dragged from his bed, tortured, and strangled in a bathroom while James was forced to participate. This murder was a tool of dominance over James, ensuring that he was too involved ever to go to the police. He was scared out of his mind. If they would do this to his half-brother, what would they do to his mother? To him? So he never went to the police. Elizabeth Hayden, who was the wife of Mark Hayden, was 37 when she was murdered in November of 1998. Her disappearance was one of the primary triggers for the police investigation. Mark Hayden's involvement in the disposal of her body was chilling, to say the least, and it really created this whole cult-like circle. But it all culminated with the final victim, the murder of David Johnson. He was 24 when he was murdered in May 1999 inside Snowtown Bank's building. David was James's stepbrother. This murder was horrific. James and Robert reportedly fried up and ate parts of David after his death. It's just so horrible to think about. But there was a lot of torture. Pretty much all of their victims were tortured. And I won't get into how or who they did it to because the victims don't deserve that. However, the Snowtown murders involved prolonged torture designed to elicit both information and gratification for the perpetrators. The victims were often bound with electrical cords, duct tape, or handcuffed and just forced to stay alive for days and hours as, their skin would be torn off. The primary instrument of torture was a Valeric metallurgy tool where John used to deliver controlled electric shocks to the victim's genitals and other sensitive areas. This tool was used not only for pleasure, but as a means of interrogation, forcing victims to reveal bank pins and social security details. Other methods they did were crushing toes with pliers, burning ears and noses with cigarettes, and in one case, inserting and lighting a sparkler into a victim's genitals. The method of killing was almost always strangulation, using ropes or jumper cables. To ensure death, John or Robert would jump on the victim's chest to dispel any remaining air from the lungs and probably break their bones in the process. After death, the bodies were crudely dismembered. John's experience in the meat industry was evident here. The dismemberment was functional and fit neatly into these plastic barrels. The barrels were filled with hydrochloric acid. John believed that this would dissolve the remains and eliminate any forensic evidence. However, he estimated the volume of biological fluid that seeps from corpses. This fluid neutralized the acid, and instead of dissolving, the bodies were preserved in an oxygen depleted fluid environment, which led to an extreme state of just decay and the worst smells imaginable. This created a challenge for the forensic team as the DNA was so degraded by the chemical environment in these barrels that profiling was thought to initially be impossible. However, the soft tissues were preserved enough to show evidence of torture. The investigation into the Snowtown murders was one of the longest and most complex in South Australia history. It began as not a search for a serial killer, but as a routine investigation into missing persons and social security fraud. A primary motive for the murders was financial gain. By impersonating victims and forging signatures, the group collected approximately $97,000 in pensions. It was confirmed that they were also collecting welfare payments for individuals who had not been seen for years, which eventually led the police to become involved, where they found surveillance cameras capturing John accessing victims' bank accounts after they disappeared. In early 1999, the group moved the barrels from various storage sites in Adelaide to the Snowtown Bank Vault, where Mark Hayden once again rented it, but he had it under the guise of storing pickled kangaroos in order to explain the smell. On May of 1999, acting on tips and leads, police breached the vaults, where they discovered the barrels containing the remains of 8 people. The trial of John and Robert lasted for 142 days and involved hundreds of witnesses. The core of the prosecution's case was the testimony of James, who gave a detailed account of the playing, which was the group's term for torture, and it was so graphic. It involved extensive suppression orders in order to prevent public trauma. James described a culture where John was treated as God or master. He testified that John and Robert appeared to relish their moments in court, viewing themselves as misunderstood heroes rather than criminals. James' confession was not just a legal turning point, but also a psychological break from John's control. He was sentenced to a minimum of 26 years, reflecting his role as an accomplice and a victim of John's grooming. In 2003, the final sentences were carried out. John, who was convicted of 11 murders, was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Robert, who was convicted of 10 murders, also received a life sentence without parole. Mark Hayden was sentenced to 25 years with an 18-year non parole period for his role in disposing of the bodies. And he's already free. He was released from prison in May of 2004. James was granted parole as well in 2005. Yeah, so this case is just a horrible tale of how someone snuck into a circle and just absolutely ruined it. John arrived. He was the first person to treat James with respect. He went around fixing things around the house and protecting the boys from creeps next door. But the creep was really inside the whole time. Some of the things I got from the trial: John would gather the neighbors and introduce people to the wall where he would point at names and show them his whole rock spider wall where he would say, "The police won't do anything, but we will." And he created a community based on a shared enemy, on these imaginary people, of how he would just say, "Oh, yep, they're pedophiles." John would take James to see the work that he would do. He would talk about the beauty of the anatomy. And later in the backyard, where John would kill stray dogs and make James watch him skin it, he would say, "It's just meat, James. Everything is just meat." The first disappearance, Clinton, John would kill him in the living room. The shock was not just the violence, but the calm after. As John explained to James, who was terrified, that Clinton was a predator and that they've done the world a favor. He then uses Clinton's credit card to buy pizza for the family, turning this horrific night into something mundane. Oh, yep, there's a dead body in our living room, but here we go. We got our Pizza Hut. The whole part where they first did their first torture on Ray, John wanted to turn into, rather than just a vigilante, into being referred to as Lord, Sir, Master. He was trying to create this larger than life persona for himself as he forced Robert and James to participate in the torture. And he recorded the sessions, telling him, "You're one of us now. There's no going back. We have you on tape." And during the murder of Troy, James was forced to hold his own brother down while John applied the shock torture, and James was emotionally destroyed after this. He was no longer a witness, he was a killer to his own brother. But unfortunately, the trauma in Snowtown isn't over yet. For the community of Snowtown, the stigma remains as being a tourist attraction. This is a town where so many horrific murders happened. Residents have struggled for decades to reclaim their town's identity from the crimes that happened here by people who didn't even originally live here. As the perpetrators are eventually released, or they have been released already, the families of the 12 victims are forced to relive the trauma, proving that the impact of the killers didn't end with just the prison sentence. The Snowtown case stands as a permanent warning that darkness can flourish, especially when you have a predator who wants to take advantage of the isolation and poverty and people around him. And that's where we're going to leave it for today's case. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you take care of yourself. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. We always love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Today was a little bit of a heavier case, so like I said, take care of yourself. If you have any case suggestions, leave them down in their Google form, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.